addition, the intervention group, half of the patients, were randomized to a daily phone-based automatic monitoring of symptoms and weight, and then daily review of that, so that every day they were getting calls saying how was your weight, how were the symptoms, and then it was recorded and was summarized for the heart failure nurses to review every day. And there was a list, there was a protocol saying if your weight's going up by more than 1%, 2% over the week, or if you've got the following symptoms, or some combination of these, then that would lead to a call from the nurse direct to the patient, and to document the response, and use that led to a face-to-face encounter. Control was just usual care as well as the first call. And they did a whole range of different measures. There was a telephone interview with quality of life scale, and that was blind to whether that was done by somebody who didn't know which group people were allocated to. And they were looking at further remission or death from any cause, not just heart failure, within 6 months of improvement. And they also looked at secondary measures at the number of hospital admissions, and a lot of resource use, time to first admission, etc. Let's say it was conservatively powered. So what are the results? Well, they screened over 5,000 patients for admission. A fair number were ineligible, as we've seen, some refused, and they enrolled about a third, which is actually a pretty high percentage for many trials. For a multi-center trial, that's a very well-run study. And you can see that nearly 80% completed within 6 months. And they were able to obtain the other data they needed on 100% of patients. It's a fairly elderly age group, as you might expect. More males than females, about 40% black. They were fairly sick. 71% had a low ejection fraction, and 46% had evidence of chronic kidney disease. So it's a fairly sick population. They looked at the adherence in the intervention group to the telehealth intervention, and 86% of the patients who were intended to participate did. 14% never made any of the calls. And they said, well, good adherence means at least 3 calls a week. And 90% did that in the first week, and that dropped down to just over half in the last week or so. So it's like drug trials. You don't get 100% adherence. And in fact, some of these drugs are probably dangerous if you took them every day as prescribed. What about the actual results that were interesting? Well, as I said, it's a negative trial. Unfortunately, about 50% of people in both groups were either admitted to hospital or died within the 6-month follow-up period. And the difference is slightly higher in the telemedicine or telehealth group. A hazard ratio, you see again, the confidence intervals cross lines. So it's possible that there's anything from a 9% benefit to a 19% worsening of the rates of admission or death. There was no difference in predefined subgroups. They looked at younger, older patients, people with better or worse heart failure, males versus females, race, and also NYHA classification. There were no differences there. There was some subgroup of patients who really benefited and others didn't. And the intervention was not more effective at sites which had more experience in using it. Sometimes you get these sites where, or studies where 30 sites and each site randomized 20 patients, and they never really got enough experience with the intervention to be able to get some benefit out of it. Well, that was not the case here. And they looked specifically to the sites that enrolled the patients. There was no evidence that it was more effective there. And you can see there the death rate, readmission rate, bed days, there's just no difference, unfortunately. They had some very thoughtful comments in their summary discussion at the end, as you might expect. First of all, they said, well, actually, they didn't force these cardiac centres to participate. It wasn't that they were reluctant or not interested in telehealth. All these centres were keen to participate. If you like, I think these were probably volunteers. There was a bit of a volunteer effect here. The other really interesting comment is that they started off, of course, with a pilot study in their own centre. And that showed, once again, you might expect from the original systematic review, a big drop in readmissions. But that relied on a single, highly skilled and motivated nurse who deployed an intervention that they developed in their own institution. So one obvious question is, did their intervention that they rolled out across the 33 centres, was it actually the same as what they did in their pilot study? And is it likely to have the same benefit as what they were doing in their pilot study? They didn't comment on that, but that's an obvious question. They also commented, they anticipated that somebody might say, well, that's a very low adherence rate. People didn't actually use the telehealth. Well, they said that that's probably better than you'd expect outside of the clinical trial setting. Yes, if you make telehealth available as a routine service, you might get lower than that 55% of people using it while about month 6. I think that's a fair comment, that often in trials there is actually quite a lot of follow-up and supervision both of the patients and of the centres. And indeed, we'll see in a minute, they did that. So we have to ask the question, was it a badly designed trial? If so, why did the New England Journal of Medicine, best journal, most difficult journal, get papers into publishing? Or was it too small a trial? We're going to have to do massive trials to show a small benefit of, say, 5% or 10%. And would that really be worth implementing telehealth? Or did they fail to measure something that was a benefit? Well, they looked at quality of life, they looked at mortality, they looked at resource utilization. They didn't show any improvements. Or did the centres not replicate the intervention? That's a possibility. Or is it just that telehealth doesn't work? I think I mentioned earlier that one risk in all of these studies is that the centres don't replicate the intervention. But in fact, they both called the patient if they hadn't had any contact. They also told the patient to contact the clinician directly if they had any urgent concern. And the trial office contacted each of the sites, 33 sites, every 2 to 3 weeks, looking at the data, checking variances. They supervised the trial very, very carefully. About the time that these trials came out, there was a fascinating news item. I don't know whether you saw this, about Chinese archaeologists unearthing 2,400-year-old Sioux. Sorry if it's still me talking, and still about telehealth. And that got me thinking, this is weird, you know. What is telehealth? What is this thing that they were trying to replicate across their 33 centres? And I think there's quite a useful analogy between cooking and managing long-term conditions. Stay with me. I don't really understand anymore. In cooking, we might have a bronze or an iron cooking pot. But into that pot, we put our ingredients according to a recipe. And some people believe that the person who does the cooking, the chef, is actually a major factor in whether the product, the meal that's served, is actually effective or tasty or nutritious or not. But of course, it has to be incorporated, you know, each individual dish is incorporated as part of a menu, and often in a restaurant served in a very glitzy or romantic ambiance. So all of these things matter when you're cooking, not just the cooking. And I believe that we can say the same is true in long-term conditions. Of course, whether we give telehealth, whether telehealth is available or not is important. But there's also elements of care, which I think are the analogy of the ingredients when you're cooking. And there's the protocol for how you combine those together, if you like, the recipe. And there's the person who is supervising that, the chef, the care or case manager. And indeed, there's the context into which that protocol fits the care pathway, a much more holistic part, you know, what's happening to this patient right the way through their long-term condition. And indeed, what kind of health system is it being delivered in? Is it glitzy? Is it romantic? Does it have a real atmosphere, like the ambiance and the rest of it? So it's not just a matter of the technology. The technology could be important in certain settings. For example, the choice of, let's go back to our cooking analogy. There are times when the choice of cooking pot really matters to what you can cook. If you've got an induction hob, then you have to have a steel pan. You can't put aluminium pans on induction, apparently. Sometimes, if you're cooking jam or cooking chutney, you can't use an aluminium pot again because it eats away, the acid eats away the metal. If you want to bring your cooking pot straight onto the table, you don't want to bring a grotty old aluminium pan onto the table. And maybe the chef has strong preferences, going to walk out of the restaurant unless you buy them a full suite of Le Creuset cashew nuts. In that case, it matters. What about in telehealth? Thinking first of the infrastructure, if you have a personal electronic health record, then probably telehealth is a vital element there. It widens the range of possible ingredients, no, care elements here. And the question is, which care elements can we only deliver through telehealth? What's the fruit and the vinegar, if you like, of managing long-term conditions? And we talked about bringing a cooking pot onto the table, making cosmetic sense. What is it about cosmetic sense? Is it a reminder for a parent, for example? And again, we talked about chefs storming out of the restaurant in a fit of heat because you didn't buy them the right kind of cooking pot. Well, maybe there are care managers out there who have strong preferences. I'm not going to work for you. I don't believe it's safe unless we do telehealth. Okay? What are these care elements? Let's think about heart failure. What are the key care elements, the ingredients of effective care? Well, clearly, education. Not only for the patient, but for the carer and for the clinician, informal care and the clinician. Longitudinal follow-up. So it's not just a one-off thing, admitted to hospital, discharged, and then we're not interested anymore. It's got to be longitudinal. Specialized clinicians, so specialized nurse managers, and coordination of care. And then obviously shared records, and that raises all sorts of interesting issues. Far greater experts here in the audience than myself on the issues, many issues around record sharing. Of course, telehealth also offers us the possibility of daily monitoring of symptoms and of weight. Well, is that a core care element for managing people with heart failure or not? I don't know. It also offers us the possibility of rapidly responding to these automatically or by just sending the results straight through to a clinician. Again, how important is a rapid response in a disease that actually has a relatively slow time course of deterioration? So that perhaps is the way we should be thinking about telehealth in heart failure. And doesn't allow us to incorporate more effective care elements than we can currently without it. I'd like to just draw your attention to some other evidence, and this is from reviews of keeping patients out of hospital with long-term conditions. This isn't about technologies, this is just what do we know about how to keep people out of hospital. It turns out that any intervention that is longer lasting, 12 weeks plus, is more likely, is more effective. Or if it's delivered at higher intensity. It's a little bit like drugs, isn't it? The more you give per day and the longer the course, the more likely you are to keep it out of hospital. Regular review by a healthcare professional. Does that mean face-to-face or is remote review through telehealth adequate? We don't know. Focusing on the specific condition, that's not a big problem. But it's interesting that there is some evidence, apparently, on keeping people out of hospital that you're more likely to be effective if you focus on asthma and diabetes, not on arthritis or COPD. And there was that question about telehealth and COPD. I've not seen any telehealth studies on arthritis. The kind of teaching that you work with the patient, with the carers, it should be very much participative. It's about an exchange of views, respecting the patient, and indeed in Britain we talk about expert patients, and there's an expert patient program. And involving the family and carers seems to be a key element of that. So there is some interesting evidence around self-management, which I think we should incorporate into our telehealth intervention design. I'd just like to mention to you some work by an old friend of mine. She was a fellow specialist registrar in chest medicine many years ago when I was in Dundee, in Glasgow. and she's now